Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have an update on the recently announced UAP investigation that will be taking place in the Office of the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. This is the first report that has been done in many, many years. It is going to be claimed to be an open public report, and it's going to be centered on science, which is, of course, much better than having it based upon building military weapons. But one of the problems they're going to run into that I'm going to point out today is the history of this whole situation. There was a former investigation that was done by Wilbert Smith from 1950 to 1954, and people will say he was not the official director. We have the documents that will show that he was the official director. People will not be able to walk around this and claim that he was not who he claimed he was. And he, as I described it, sort of buried a couple of bodies in the basement. And what's going to happen with this new scientific investigation, they state that it's going to be public. They're going to look at all the material, and they're going to look at the history of UFO investigation in Canada, which means the stuff I'm going to show you today, they're going to actually have to deal with, and they're going to have to explain what this is all about. So the way they've set it up now is we've got this investigation. We don't know what these UAPs are, and we're very curious, and we're going to do science, and we're going to figure out what all this stuff is. And what you basically have is the Canadians have already come to the conclusion. They came to the conclusion 70 years ago, and now we're going to start all over again and pretend that what happened 70 years ago did not happen. The bodies in the basement will have to be uncovered, and they were going to have to be dealt with. Bill Clinton was the guy that sort of described the problem that I think the Canadian Science Advisor now faces, and that is that he was forced to deal with the UFO issue by Lawrence Rockefeller, who was a billionaire who had gone to the White House and stated that he was going to get UFO disclosure from the president, and he didn't care what anybody said. He was going to get it. He had the power, and he was cut off at the pass. And the whole idea is that the president cannot touch the subject. So they did not allow him near the president, but he was dealt with by the science advisor to the president of the United States, which is basically the same office that is going to be dealing with the UAP problem in Canada, the science advisor. So the science advisor was dealing with all this kind of material. And behind the scenes, Bill Clinton was sort of giving advice, but he was never sort of on the record. Now, Lawrence Rockefeller gave a briefing to Bill and Hillary Clinton. He tried to give a briefing. This is at the Rockefeller Ranch in 1995. Here you can see Hillary Clinton has arrived at the ranch, and you can see that Lawrence has given her a book. They're going to the Rockefeller cabin on this in Wyoming. And the book we actually discovered later on was a book on the implications of the discovery of extraterrestrial life in the solar system. And so she's got this book, and basically what happens is Lawrence wants to get the president away from the CIA and from all the Washington people, get him at his ranch, and then he can give him a briefing on UFOs, or a citizen's briefing on UFOs, and try to get his UFO disclosure thing going. The problem was that the president basically could not be involved again. So basically what happened is Lawrence gave his little spiel and showed his documents and why this should be declassified and why something should be done about UFOs. And Hillary was there. Hillary listened to the whole thing. And then the next morning, she said to Lawrence at breakfast, she said, okay, we've listened to your pitch for UFOs. Now don't ever bring up the subject again. Bill did not attend the briefing because everybody would know that this briefing would become public, and if it became known that the president was sitting in a UFO briefing, then he's facing 64 questions that he really doesn't want to answer or can't answer. And so this is what happened at the Rockefeller Ranch. Now, later at the ranch, Lawrence Rockefeller, according to, I think Whitley Strieber told this story, Whitley Strieber says that Rockefeller and Bill Clinton were out walking around the ranch, and Bill said to him, he said, this story is like the Arkansas tar baby story. And this is a story that is told in Arkansas. This is the story where Brer Rabbit is caught by the fox. The fox sets a trap for the Brer Rabbit to catch him, and what he does is he sets up a tar baby made out of tar along the side of the road, And Brer Rabbit comes along in the morning and sees this baby and says, "Good morning." And of course, the tar baby doesn't say anything. And he says it again and again, and the tar baby doesn't reply. And Brer Rabbit gets very angry, and then he punches the tar baby. And of course, his hand gets stuck to the tar baby. Then he punches him with the other hand, and that hand gets stuck to the tar baby. Then he kicks him with his foot, and then that foot gets caught, and then with the other foot. And next thing you know, he's caught. Brer Rabbit is caught by the fox, and he's all tangled up with the sticky tar baby. So that's what Bill Clinton was saying, is that you cannot touch the UFO story. It's like the Arkansas tar baby story. You'll get stuck to it. This is in the days before we started talking about the hitchhiker effect, the idea that when you touch this subject, it will follow you around. And Bill didn't want to answer the questions. And so they play the game that the president doesn't know what's going on. He's very stupid. They don't tell him. He doesn't have a right to know. Meanwhile, in the background, he knows what's going on, but there is no official record of him ever having been briefed on the subject. This is the situation that they're going to be facing in Canada, because we have documents, and I'm going to show you these documents, that if they basically say they are going to look at all the material and the history of this, these are kind of documents that they're going to have to face. So they're saying, well, we really don't know what's going on. UAP is a big mystery, and we as the scientists we're going to solve this mystery, and everybody pitch in, and we can find out how to investigate UFOs. We're not going to file sightings, but we're going to sort of advise people on how to answer this UFO intelligence problem as to what's really going on here. Now, the director of the science panel is Dr. Mona Nemer, and interestingly, she was a professor and vice president of research at the University of Ottawa. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the University of Ottawa is where all the original Canadian government files are kept. Wilbert Smith, who ran it, his son James Smith, hid the files after his father died, and then he gave them to the University of Ottawa. So all these files are there, and I've got an entire copy of all the files. And I'm not sure whether we have them online, but they will be online, that people can actually look at maybe 10,000 pages of files and stuff like this, books and documents that Wilbur Smith collected during his career. And in those documents, we found some very interesting stuff that is going to have to be addressed, because the game is being played now. We really don't know what's going on. Whereas in the 1950s, Wilbert Smith claimed we knew exactly what was going on. Now, here's what they're proposing for this new Sky Canada project. And they want transparency to prevent conspiracy theories. So we're going to have, transparency, and we're going to collaborate with the U.S. for best practices. Larry Maguire, you'll see on this slide, was the guy who started this whole thing. He's a Conservative member of Parliament in the opposition here in Manitoba, in the part of the federal government, and he requested in the House of Commons for an investigation to be done. And Dr. Nemer agreed and decided, okay, we're going to carry on with this study. Now, those files that I mentioned from the University of Ottawa that I have copies of were all given to Larry Maguire a couple of years ago. So Larry Maguire has these files. He knows what's in these, whether he's read them or not, I'm not sure, but they were provided access to all these files by myself. Now, in my book, The Canadian Government UFO Story, the Wilbur Smith Files, I go through the history of the Canadian government investigation that took place from 1950 to 1954. And basically what happened is Wilbur had been investigating, talking to American officials, talking to the Canadian Embassy, and was working on a propulsion theory, and then detected a UFO flying over Ottawa. And the Canadian government was on the spot of having detected a flying saucer over the nation's capital. They shut the program down and pretended nothing had happened and nothing really had occurred. Unfortunately for the Canadian government, Wilbert made sure that when he died, he knew he was dying of cancer. He told his wife to make sure that she didn't give the files to anybody. She told officials that came that she had destroyed the files, when in fact her son was hiding the files. and then they eventually put them, so the story has been recovered. And this is what I call, this is the bodies that Wilbert buried in the basement that are now going to have to be unburied and dealt with. Here's Wilbur and Merle Smith. I had an interview with Merle Smith. She told me a lot of this stuff. Wilbur died in 62. I interviewed her in about 1977. And he gets into a lot of philosophical stuff, like the idea of the oneness, the whole idea now of the computer simulation. There is only awareness and nothing at all, and awareness injects into nothing at all a concept which will render it unique. These are kind of things that Wilbur was working on back in the 1950s, which indicated he was sort of ahead of the game as to how this thing all fit together. And he was very, very vocal. I think that's where I try to emulate him in terms of the fact that he was very open about what he was doing. There was classified material, but other than that, he told people what was going on. Now, here's the main body in the basement that they're going to have to unbury, and that is Wilbur Smith wrote a top secret memo in 1950, November of 1950, to the Department of Transport. And in that memo, was part of what he wrote. I made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff in Washington and was able to obtain the following information. Number one, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rated higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. And the thing that we've now started to push, I was further informed by the United States authorities are investigating along several lines, which might be related to the saucers, such as mental phenomena. And I gather that they are not doing very well because they've stated if we're working on it, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us. So we're in a game here where we're saying we really don't know what's going on. This is all a big mystery. And yet the Canadian government is officially on the record with a top secret memo that was declassified by them. You can go to the Department of Transport files and you can actually find this document. They declassified it. It is an official document and said flying saucers exist. And a lot of this stuff was told to Wilbur Smith by American officials. So this is the biggest one. There are a number of documents that they're going to have trouble explaining, but this is the big one where right from the word go, 1950 on, the Canadians are told this thing's for real and it's of tremendous significance. Here's the second big body that's buried in the basement that the Canadians are going to have to deal with when they do this new report and maybe try to come to the conclusion that we really don't know what's going on, is that Wilbur Smith was a contactee. We have known this right from the word go. We didn't mention anything about it in the early years because it was not seen to be a great thing to be talking about. But now there's a lot of people who accept the fact that there are people who have some sort of contact with the intelligence. Wilbur Smith was very open about the fact that he was in contact through a bunch of people and through himself with an alien that he called Alpha, and he mentions an alien by the name of Tyla, and then there's Ponar, and Wilbur deals with a lot of material, and he writes a book. There's only about 200 copies, I think, that were made, maybe not even that. I have 3 copies of this book. It was put out in 1964 by James Smith and Wilbur Smith's wife. The last bit of it was never finished because Wilbur died, but it says quite clearly in the very front of the book, assembled by Wilbert Bruckhouse Smith from data obtained from beings more advanced than we are. He claims quite clearly that the material that was in this book, talking about how the universe is formed and how matter is created and the basics of the universe, was given to him by a non-human intelligence. So they're going to have to explain what this was all about. This is what we used to call the Caswell letter. We've put it out a few times, but it suddenly caught fire this time when we put it out. I think there's almost 100,000 views of this document. This is a document. Wilbur Smith died in 1962. This is a document that he wrote in 1959 to Mr. Caswell. And the important part is where he talks about in the third paragraph. He says, "For your information, every," and he puts it in capitals, "every nation on this planet has been officially informed of the existence of spacecraft and their occupants from elsewhere. And as nations, they must accept responsibility for any lack of action or for more to be done along these lines. Effort in this direction is wasted." So he basically says it's a waste of time trying to get governments to admit it. But you have the United States now saying they don't know what's going on. And it looks like the Canadians are going to try to go down the same route and say this is a big mystery and we should put some money into this and investigate this and give it to science. When in fact, Wilbur Smith states they knew right from the word go exactly what was going on. And a number of governments were in contact. I'm not sure how it actually happened, but that the governments know what's going on. This is a very difficult document they're going to have to deal with, and it has to do with destroying documents. This is a Defense Research Board document. The Defense Research Board was basically the arm of the Canadian defense establishment that developed weapons. So it would be equivalent to maybe DARPA, the private, DARPA organization where you contract out different ideas of weapons. So the Defense Research Board agreed with this. And basically what this is just before Blue Book was shut down, this document was put out, and it talks about the Project Magnet report. So that was the name of Wilbur Smith's report, where he comes to the conclusion that this thing's for real, flying saucers exist, the Americans are working on this. They figure mental phenomena is part of the whole thing. And so this document deals with that report, and it says, I'll read it here. Since the question of flying saucers is still attracting public attention, and since this file, the Project Magnet file, covers documents relative to the discussion in the Department of Transport, that's where Wilbur Smith worked, surrounding Project Magnet, which is confidential in nature, it is recommended that this file be downclassed to at least the confidential level. At no time should it be made available to the public. Then at the very end, this W.J. Wilson writes, a copy of the Project Magnet report on this file is the original and should not be destroyed until such time as this subject has, and he puts in quotes, cooled off. It's going to be very hard for them to explain that we're going to do an independent investigation when you have documents that have been revealed as to how they tried to cover up what Wilbur Smith was doing and tried to sort of downclass it. And as soon as the subject would become less talked about, destroy the documents. This is the main contact that Wilbur had to AFA, who is the being. Wilbur talks quite openly about AFA and what he was told. There's a number of stories that were told about contacts, about a gravity control device that he was trying to build based upon what AFA was telling him. What was called a binding meter. Wilbur Smith was big on nuclear weapons and said that it was causing areas of reduced binding. And the AFA gave him a piece of equipment that he built to detect these areas of reduced binding that he said were causing planes to crash. This woman, her name is Frances Swan. She lived in Elliott, Maine, just down the street from Betty Hill, which was kind of unusual because Betty Hill was sort of like the where the Greys start, and Frances Swan was in contact with what she called the good ones. And what we had heard, the story was told that when they took Betty Hill to see Frances Swan heard that she was dealing with the Greys, and she had this interpretation that they were the bad guys, and that she really didn't want to talk to Betty Hill anymore after that. The important part of this whole story is she was advising the Canadians. In fact, there's another document that they're going to have to explain that we will we'll eventually bring all these documents if we're allowed to present evidence. But there's a document that is both in the U.S. Air Force, and it's also in the FBI. And this describes a meeting. You can tell very clearly the meeting is Wilbert Smith goes down to visit this woman in Elliott, Maine, and he's asking her to arrange a flyby for for AFA to fly over the nation's capital in Canada. And the arrangement is made for Saturday, August the 1st, 1954. The flyby actually occurs a week later, August the 8th, 1954. And she is arranging AFA to come by. And from what I was told, the equipment all went off the chart when that happened. I talked to one of the radar engineers that was working at the place where they had all these detection equipment for UFOs, and he said the chart, the paper that they were running through the machines with the needles went right off the chart. They went outside. There was overcast. They couldn't tell what had caused this, but they definitely knew it wasn't a plane. It was at that point the Canadian government shut the whole program down. So Frances Swan was the woman who set this flyby up. She's also the one that arranged another very difficult story the Canadians are going to have to deal with, and that is the story of Suffield Base. It's an Army base in Alberta, which is a no-fly zone, almost like Area 51, and that the Canadian government has admitted, Paul Hellyer actually admitted in a speech in 1967, the story that was being told about Frances Swan and Wilbur Smith was the fact that the Canadian government had actually opened up Suffield for AFA to land. Now, the story was told to me by Wilbur Smith's wife was the fact that Wilbur wanted a guarantee that the AFA would be allowed to land without interference, and that was agreed by the RCMP, the military, and by the cabinet of the Canadian Parliament. And then he wanted to guarantee that once they had discussions with AFA on the ground, that he would be allowed to take off, and he did not get a guarantee from the Prime Minister. And so Wilbur called it off. He said, "That's it. We're not. Nobody's going to land." And that's where the story came from. So they opened the base. Nothing landed there, but the story is why? How would you know where to land? Somebody had to be in contact. Now, Frances Swan is also responsible for another huge story that they're going to have to explain, and that is the story of the 1959 story of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which was one of the most highly classified CIA buildings in Washington, D.C. This is where they analyzed all the U-2, all the SR-71, and all the spy photographs, and did the digital analysis and all this kind of stuff. The guy who ran the program was a guy by the name of Arthur Lundahl, who was a photographic expert, and he was very interested in UFOs. And at one point, two Navy intelligence guys, one that worked also for the CIA, went to see Frances Swan in Maine and to get information from her and to talk to her. They'd seen her in 54, and then in 59 they went back, and they said they were doing it for airtime, for flight time. But they went there, and then she said, "Well, why don't I just teach you how to do it?" And she takes the one Navy intelligence guy, who I think his name was Nisham, sits him down, puts her right hand on his shoulder, and suddenly this guy starts going into automatic writing. He starts talking to this AFA alien, and they're absolutely enamored by this whole thing. They run back to Washington, D.C. He goes to the CIA, the National Photographic Interpretation Center, talking to Art Lundahl, and describes this whole story. And Art Lundahl, we actually have documents with Art Lundahl confirming that this actually took place, and that was that they Art Lundahl said, "Okay, well, let's talk to this alien." So they sit the alien, the Navy intelligence guy down, and he starts to go into trance. And then they're asking all sorts of questions of this non-human intelligence. And at one point, Arthur Lundahl says, "We want some proof." And then the guy goes from sort of automatic writing to actual talking. And he said, "What do you want?" And then Art Lundahl says, "We want you to show yourself." And then the reply came back when Art Lundahl said now, and the guy doing this channeling thing said, "Go to the window." And here you actually have Robert Friend, who was the guy who ran Project Blue Book, actually goes on camera to my friend Bob Emenegger, and he tells this entire story. He was called in 2 days later to investigate this story. He was told the whole story about how they had made this contact, and he goes to the window. This is from the documentary. He goes to the window, and the story he tells is that he was told that when they went to the window, according to AFA's instructions, a UFO flew by in plain daylight and flew over top of the Capitol. And so the second time, when 2 days later, this is July of 1959, Robert Friend, they put the guy back into trance again. He starts communicating with AFA, and then they ask for him to appear again or to show himself again. And the reply comes back, the time is not right. Friend goes back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he tells his general, he said, this woman is onto something. We need to investigate this woman. And the general says it's being handled by another agency. Get your hands off it. So this channeling situation where we have the handwritten version of the document that was given with all the CIA names in the document of people who were in the room, and that's all there. This is not a story where Wilbur sort of was guessing it was going on. This is the kind of stuff that was going on in the background that they are going to have to explain. And the other thing that they'll have to explain is stuff that we will maybe do in another update, is the whole thing with metals that I dealt with a guy by the name of A.W.L. Bridge, who was the metallurgist who was working for Wilbert Smith. Wilbert Smith had a Navy guy, an Air Force guy. He had different people who are secretly working with him without being publicly identified, almost like an invisible college working on these experiments, what AFA was telling them to build and stuff like that. And he talks an awful lot about hardware. And we actually have descriptions. We have James Smith, who unfortunately just died a couple of months ago, Wilbur Smith's son. I have an interview with him talking about the fact that Wilbur told him on his deathbed that he had seen the bodies, he had seen the craft. The bodies were not grays, they were just little people. And that blue military cars would pull up to the house, and Wilbur Smith was getting material from the United States. And one of the pieces Wilbur describes quite clearly, without any reservation, is the fact that the U.S. Air Force in July of 1952 shot a piece off a small UFO. It was recovered by a guy from the CIA, and that piece actually came to Canada. It was analyzed in Canada. Wilbur Smith is very open about that. He's not very open about where he sent it back, but he does admit that, yes, they were getting material from the United States. So to end it, this is basically what the Canadians have walked into. This is the tar baby they have touched, and they're going to get stuck to. It's going to drag around with them like a hitchhiker, and they are not going to be able to shake this, because there are just piles of stories of the fact that the Canadian government knew exactly what was going on and was very open about this. And if they try to go back to, we don't know what's going on and it's all a big mystery, I will do whatever I can to make sure that the truth be told. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we can do this again soon. I have another update coming, and it has to do with Travis Walton and nuclear weapons. It's something I'll be talking about at the MUFON conference in August. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and I'll give you the short version of it. Every single night that Travis Walton was gone, there was a UFO over a nuclear storage site or a nuclear weapon, either at Malmstrom or Loring Air Force Base, every single night that Travis was gone. So we'll get into that whole thing about what was going on in 1975 when I got involved, when Linda Howe got involved, when Stephen Greer got involved, where Bud Hopkins got involved. 75 was a very peculiar year. It was the top year for cattle mutilations, black helicopters, all this kind of stuff. And that'll be my next update. I'm going to do a little bit about that. And it's all being posted now on my Twitter and my Facebook as I unravel this material and put it up. But thanks again for listening, and hopefully we can do it again soon.